Men rushed to save baby gorilla from Anaconda. What the mother did was terrifying. The morning mist clung to the canopy like gossamer threads, filtering the early sunlight into ethereal beams that danced through the dense foliage of the Congolese rainforest. Jesse Martinez adjusted his grip on the steering wheel of the dusty Land Cruiser, his knuckles white against the cracked leather. 6 months. That's how long he'd been wearing the Ranger's uniform. And still the weight of responsibility felt foreign on his shoulders, like an ill-fitting coat passed down from someone much larger. Beside him, Harold Benton sat with the easy posture of a man who had made peace with the wilderness decades ago. His weathered hands rested casually on his knees, fingers scarred from countless encounters with thorns, claws, and the unforgiving reality of conservation work. At 62, Harold possessed that particular brand of calm that comes only from having stared death in the face so many times that it had become merely another acquaintance rather than a stranger. The GPS device mounted on the dashboard had been spinning uselessly for the past 20 minutes, its digital compass rotating in endless circles as satellites failed to penetrate the thick canopy overhead. Jesse glanced at it again, frustration building in his chest like steam in a kettle. The camera traps at the remote outpost needed checking, and they were already behind schedule. Harold noticed the younger man's agitation and spoke without opening his eyes. The veteran ranger had developed an almost supernatural ability to read tension in others, a skill honed through years of managing volatile situations with both animals and humans. The old shortcut Harold mentioned was more memory than road, a forgotten track that had once connected mining camps in the colonial era. Vines had reclaimed much of it, and fallen trees created natural barriers that required careful navigation. But Harold knew every twist, every hidden pothole, every place where the earth had shifted after the rains. As they turned into the familiar bend, the forest seemed to exhale around them. Birds that had been chattering in the canopy fell suddenly silent. Even the ever-present hum of insects diminished to a whisper. Harold's eyes snapped open, his entire body shifting into alertness. In the wild, silence was never peaceful. It was a warning. The metallic scent hit them simultaneously, carried on a breeze that seemed to materialize from nowhere. Blood, fresh blood. Harold had encountered this smell countless times from poaching incidents, territorial battles between rival guerrilla troops, the aftermath of leopard kills. But something about this particular scent made his skin crawl. It carried with it an urgency, a wrongness that set every instinct screaming. Jesse began to accelerate, his rookie eagerness to help overriding caution. Harold's hands shot out, gripping the gear shift and forcing the vehicle to slow. Experience had taught him that rushing toward unknown danger was the surest way to transform a rescue into a tragedy. Through the settling dust kicked up by their tires, the scene revealed itself with horrifying clarity. The ancient asphalt, cracked and weathered by decades of neglect, provided a stage for nature's most brutal drama. Coiled in the center of the road was a massive anaconda, its body easily 20 feet in length and thick as a man's torso. The snake's scales gleamed with an oily iridescence in the filtered sunlight, each one perfectly designed for the creature's deadly purpose. Trapped within those crushing coils was a young gorilla, no more than 2 years old. The infant's arms flailed weakly against the constricting muscle, tiny fingers grasping desperately at air. Each breath came in shorter gasps as the anaconda's grip tightened with methodical precision. The snake's ancient programming was executing perfectly. Apply pressure and wait for the struggles to weaken, then swallow the prize whole. But this was not happening in the isolated depths of the jungle, where nature's cruelties typically unfolded unseen. Nearby, crashing through the undergrowth with earth-shaking force, came the infant's mother. She was magnificent and terrifying in equal measure, her silverback form standing nearly 6 feet tall when she reared up on her hind legs. Her massive hands, each capable of crushing bones like twigs, clawed frantically at the living rope that held her child. The gorilla mother's roars shattered the forest silence, each vocalization a complex symphony of rage, desperation, and anguish that needed no translation. She struck at the anaconda repeatedly, her knuckles tearing against the snake's armored hide, leaving bloody scratches that the reptile barely seemed to notice. The snake had evolved to withstand such attacks, Its flexible spine and loose skin allowed it to absorb tremendous punishment while maintaining its death grip. Jesse's hand moved instinctively toward the door handle. His entire body coiled to spring into action. The sight of the struggling infant triggered every heroic impulse he possessed. But Harold's weathered hand clamped down on his wrist with surprising strength, holding him in place with the authority of hard-earned wisdom. The veteran ranger was already conducting a tactical assessment with the cold efficiency that had kept him alive through 4 decades in the field. His eyes swept the scene, cataloging every detail. The gorilla mother's position relative to potential escape routes, the anaconda's body language and stress indicators, wind direction, available cover, the dozen variables that would determine whether any rescue attempt would succeed or simply add 2 more victims to the tragedy. Harold stepped out of the vehicle with deliberate slowness, his movements calculated to avoid triggering any additional aggression from either animal. Jesse followed, his younger legs eager to close the distance. But Harold's raised hand kept him in check. They positioned themselves behind the vehicle's bulk, using it as both shield and observation point. The scene before them defied every nature documentary Jesse had ever watched. This wasn't the sanitized version of wilderness survival typically presented to audiences safe in their living rooms. This was raw, brutal, and immediate. The infant gorilla's struggles were weakening visibly with each passing second. Its eyes, so human in their expression of terror and confusion, searched desperately for its mother's face. The anaconda showed no emotion, no malice, no awareness of the drama it had created. It was simply following millions of years of genetic programming, applying the precise pressure needed to subdue prey without wasting energy. The snake's head remained alert, constantly scanning for additional threats, while its body performed its deadly work with mechanical efficiency. Harold's mind raced through possibilities and probabilities. Direct confrontation with the anaconda would likely provoke it to accelerate the killing process, but allowing the constriction to continue would guarantee the infant's death within minutes. The gorilla mother's frantic attacks were actually making the situation worse, causing the snake to tighten its coils in response to perceived threats. The veteran ranger spotted 2 sturdy poles among the roadside debris remnants of an old fence line that had once marked territorial boundaries. They were roughly 5 feet in length, thick enough to provide leverage, but light enough to maneuver quickly. He gestured for Jesse to take one while positioning himself for what he hoped would be a coordinated strike. But first, and they had to deal with the most dangerous variable in the equation, the gorilla mother herself. Her protective instincts had overridden all caution, making her as potentially deadly to rescuers as the anaconda itself. A fully grown female gorilla possessed the strength to tear a human being limb from limb, and in her current state of maternal fury, she might not distinguish between threats and helpers. Harold had spent years studying gorilla behavior, learning to read the subtle signals that preceded either aggression or acceptance. He understood that their social hierarchy was based on complex displays of dominance and submission, and that approaching incorrectly could trigger devastating violence. Moving with exaggerated slowness, Harold raised both hands above his head, fingers spread wide in the universal gesture of non-aggression. He then gradually lowered himself into a crouch, reducing his apparent size and positioning himself below the gorilla's eye level. It was a technique he had learned from Jane Goodall's research, a way of communicating peaceful intent in a language older than human speech. The gorilla mother's head swiveled toward him, her dark eyes blazing with protective fury. For a terrifying moment, Harold thought she might charge. Her massive form tensed, muscles bunching beneath her coat like coiled springs. But something in his posture, his careful, non-threatening approach, gave her pause. She remained focused on the anaconda, but no longer treated the humans as immediate dangers. Jesse understood the plan without need for detailed explanation. While Harold worked to gain the snake's attention through leverage applied to its midsection, Jesse would create a distraction at the tail end. It wasn't elegant, but it might be enough to confuse the anaconda's simple nervous system long enough to break its grip. The younger ranger circled wide, keeping the vehicle between himself and the gorilla mother. His heart hammered against his ribs as he approached the anaconda's muscular tail. Up close, the snake was even more impressive and terrifying. Individual scales the size of coins overlapped in perfect patterns, creating armor that had protected anacondas for millions of years. The tail itself was easily as thick as Jesse's thigh, packed with muscle capable of delivering bone-crushing blows. Jesse struck with his pole, aiming not to injure but to startle. The reaction was immediate and violent. The anaconda's head whipped around with lightning speed, jaws gaping to reveal backwards curved teeth designed to prevent escape once prey was seized. The snake's mouth could dislocate to swallow animals much larger than itself, and those teeth would ensure that anything bitten would be dragged inexorably toward the gullet. Harold didn't hesitate. The moment the anaconda's attention shifted to Jesse, he drove his pole deep between the coils and the infant's ribcage. The leverage was awkward, and the snake's muscle density made it feel like trying to pry apart steel cables. But Harold threw his entire body weight behind the effort, using techniques learned from years of moving fallen trees and trapped animals. The anaconda's reaction was explosive. Its entire body convulsed as competing instincts battled within its primitive brain, maintain the grip on certain prey, or defend against the new threat. The pole bit deeper between the coils, and Harold felt the first hint of loosening in the snake's deadly embrace. But the anaconda's thrashing tail caught Jesse off guard. The massive appendage swept his legs from under him, sending him crashing to the cracked asphalt. As the tail whipped back for another strike, Harold abandoned his position and threw himself sideways, covering Jesse's fallen form with his own body. The tail struck Harold's back with tremendous force, driving the air from his lungs and sending white-hot pain shooting down his spine. Jesse's question came out as a wheeze, his lungs struggling to process the adrenaline flooding his system. Harold's back felt like it had been struck by a telephone pole, but nothing seemed broken. He had taken worse hits from charging buffalo and lived to tell about it. The momentary distraction had achieved its purpose. With the anaconda's coils loosened even slightly, the gorilla mother saw her opportunity. She lunged forward with a roar that seemed to shake the very trees, her massive hands seizing the snake's body near the infant's head. Her fingers, each one possessing the grip strength of a mechanical vise, began tearing at the remaining coils. The anaconda found itself caught between two impossible choices: maintain its grip and face certain destruction from the gorilla's devastating strength, or release its prey and retreat to fight another day. Evolutionary programming chose survival over immediate satisfaction. The snake's coils began to unwind with fluid grace, each loop releasing its hold as the anaconda prepared for escape. The infant gorilla dropped to the asphalt like a discarded doll, its tiny chest barely moving. The anaconda gathered itself into a defensive coil, its head weaving hypnotically as it assessed threats from multiple directions. For a moment that stretched like eternity, the four beings, two human, one gorilla, one snake, remained frozen in a tableau of mutual wariness. Then the anaconda made its decision. With movements that seemed impossibly fluid for something so large, it flowed toward the forest edge. Its body moved in perfect sinusoidal waves, each muscle group working in precise coordination to propel 20 feet of predator with surprising speed. At the tree line, the snake paused, its ancient eyes studying the scene one final time, as if memorizing the faces that had cost it a meal. Then it vanished into the green shadows with barely a rustle of leaves. The silence that followed was profound and terrible. The infant gorilla lay motionless on the sun-baked asphalt, its small form seeming impossibly fragile in the aftermath of violence. The mother approached slowly, her earlier fury replaced by something far more heartbreaking, hope tinged with desperate fear. She nudged her child gently with one massive finger, the same gesture human mothers use to wake sleeping babies. No response. She made a sound unlike her earlier roars, a low, questioning vocalization that seemed to ask why her child wouldn't wake up. The sound carried all the anguish of any parent facing the unthinkable, translated across species barriers by the universal language of loss. Harold rose slowly, every movement telegraphed and non-threatening. His first aid kit was basic, designed more for treating cuts and sprains on human rangers than performing emergency medicine on infant primates. But the principles remained the same: airways, breathing, circulation. The holy trinity of emergency response that applied regardless of species. As he knelt beside the infant, the gorilla mother's growl rumbled through the air like distant thunder. Her eyes locked with Harold's, searching for intention. for threat, for any sign that this strange, hairless ape might harm her child further. What she saw in Harold's weathered face seemed to reassure her. Perhaps she recognized the careful gentleness of his approach, or perhaps desperation, made her willing to accept help from any source. Harold placed his hands on the infant's chest, feeling for the weak flutter of a heartbeat. The little gorilla was still alive, but barely. Its breathing was shallow and irregular, each breath a struggle against damaged ribs and compressed organs. Harold began chest compressions with exquisite care, using far less pressure than he would on a human patient. Gorilla bone structure was different, and too much force could cause fatal internal injuries. The cold pack from his first aid kit went immediately to the infant's head. Oxygen deprivation was the greatest threat. Now brain damage could occur within minutes of cardiac arrest. The cold might slow metabolic processes, buying precious time for recovery. The gorilla mother watched every movement with laser intensity. Her massive form trembled with barely contained emotion, fear for her child, uncertainty about the human's intentions, gratitude for assistance, and the terrible helplessness of being unable to help in the way that mattered most. Her eyes never left Harold's face, reading micro-expressions with the fluency of a creature whose survival had always depended on understanding the intentions of others. Minutes passed like hours. Harold's compressions continued with metronomic precision, each push calculated to move blood through tiny vessels without causing additional trauma. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the morning coolness, and his back protested every movement after the anaconda's punishing blow. Then a cough, weak and rattling, but unmistakably the sound of lungs trying to clear themselves. The infant's eyelids fluttered, and its tiny fingers twitched against the asphalt. Another cough, stronger this time, followed by the most beautiful sound Harold had heard in decades, a small, querulous cry of confusion and discomfort. The transformation in the gorilla mother was immediate and profound. The tension drained from her massive frame as she reached for her child with trembling hands. Her touch was infinitely gentle as she lifted the infant to her chest, cradling it against the warmth of her body. One enormous finger traced the baby's face with surgical precision, checking eyes, nose, mouth, neck every inch, examined with the thoroughness of a medical professional and the tenderness of unconditional love. Her eyes found Harold's again, and in that moment, something passed between them that transcended species boundaries. Not gratitude exactly, that was too human a concept. Not friendship, which required ongoing relationship. Instead, it was recognition. An acknowledgement that two beings had worked together to preserve life, that their shared goal had briefly united them in purpose, despite the vast evolutionary gulf between them. The gorilla mother then did something that left both men speechless. She approached Jesse, who still sat on the roadside, breathing heavily from adrenaline and exertion, her massive hand extended toward him, stopping just inches from his face. For a heartbeat, her finger hovered in the air, as if she wanted to touch this other strange ape who had risked himself for her child. But the boundary between species, between wild and civilized, proved too great to cross completely. Her hand withdrew, and she stepped back, her eyes still holding Jesse's, but maintaining the distance that instinct demanded. It was a gesture of acknowledgement rather than acceptance, recognition that he too had played a role in her child's salvation, but also understanding that their worlds could intersect only briefly before natural order reasserted itself. With her infant secure against her chest, the gorilla mother turned toward the forest. Her retreat was dignified rather than hurried, each step measured and purposeful. At the forest edge, she paused and looked back one final time. Her gaze swept over both men, and Harold could swear he saw something like a nod, an acknowledgement of debt that could never be repaid but would never be forgotten. Then she was gone, absorbed by the green shadows as completely as if she had never existed. Only the scuff marks on the asphalt and the lingering musk of her presence proved that the encounter had been real rather than some fever dream born of too many years in the wilderness. Jesse and Harold stood in the sudden quiet, both men processing what they had just experienced. The forest around them gradually resumed its normal rhythms, birds cautiously returning to their songs, insects buzzing back to life, the eternal whisper of wind through leaves. But something fundamental had changed in both men. They had crossed a threshold, participated in a moment of pure connection that transcended the artificial boundaries humans typically erected between themselves and the natural world. Jesse broke the silence first, his voice hoarse with emotion and residual adrenaline. The younger ranger was grappling with the realization that this was what the job truly meant, not the paperwork and routine patrols he had expected, but moments of life and death decision-making where courage and instinct mattered more than protocol. Harold's response was measured, carrying the weight of 4 decades spent navigating the complex relationships between human civilization and untamed wilderness. He had seen poachers gun down entire guerrilla families for the market value of their hands. He had watched habitat destruction drive species to the brink of extinction. But he had also witnessed moments like this one, instances where human and animal interests aligned in the simple goal of preserving life. They drove the rest of the way to the outpost in contemplative silence, each man lost in private thoughts about what they had witnessed. The camera traps could wait another hour. Some experiences needed time to settle, to find their proper place in the catalog of memory. The months that followed brought the usual rhythm of ranger duties, equipment, maintenance, patrol schedules, incident reports, the endless bureaucracy that kept conservation efforts functioning. But Harold found himself returning again and again to the stretch of old road where they had encountered the Anaconda and the gorilla family. Something about that place had changed for him. It was no longer just another location on the map, but a sacred space where the fundamental interconnectedness of all life had revealed itself. Jesse threw himself into his work with renewed purpose. The encounter had stripped away any romantic notions about conservation work while simultaneously showing him why the job mattered in ways that transcended salary and career advancement. He studied guerrilla behavior with new intensity, learning to read the subtle signs that might indicate distress or displacement. His reports became models of thoroughness and insight, earning recognition from superiors who noted the young ranger's rapid professional development. Harold began teaching again, something he had avoided for years after his official retirement from training duties. He found himself sharing the lessons learned on that dusty road, not just the tactical knowledge of how to handle dangerous situations, but the deeper wisdom about respecting the intelligence and emotional complexity of the animals they were sworn to protect. The story of their encounter spread through the ranger community with the inevitable embellishment that accompanies any tale worth telling. Each retelling added new details, transformed minor elements into major plot points, and gradually elevated a simple rescue into the stuff of legend. Harold listened to these expanded versions with amusement, recognizing that the story had taken on a life of its own, independent of the actual events. But he also understood why the story resonated so strongly with his colleagues. In a profession that dealt primarily with the aftermath of human destructiveness, poaching sites, habitat destruction, the species decline, their encounter represented something different. It was a story of successful intervention, of humans and animals working together rather than in opposition. It offered hope in a field where hope was often in short supply. Spring brought the annual equipment inventory, a tedious process that required visiting every remote outpost to catalog and maintain surveillance equipment. Harold volunteered for the assignment that would take them back to the camera traps near their original destination, though he didn't share his real motivation with Jesse or their supervisors. The old shortcut had been partially cleared since their last visit, making the drive easier but somehow less atmospheric. Progress, Harold reflected, was often a double-edged sword. The improvements made the forest more accessible to rangers and researchers, but they also opened new pathways for poachers and illegal loggers. As they approached the familiar bend in the road, both men found themselves scanning the forest with unusual intensity. The rational part of Harold's mind knew that gorillas were nomadic, following food sources and seasonal patterns that might take them dozens of miles from this location. The chances of encountering the same family group were minimal. But the forest had its own logic, and sometimes probability yielded to possibility in ways that defied scientific explanation. As they crested a small rise that overlooked a natural clearing, Jesse pointed toward movement in the canopy. A troop of gorillas was crossing from one section of forest to another, moving with the unhurried confidence of animals in familiar territory. Harold raised his binoculars with hands that trembled slightly from excitement rather than age. The troop was larger than he had expected, perhaps 15 individuals, ranging from silverback patriarch to newborn infants clinging to their mothers' backs. They moved with the fluid coordination of a family unit that had learned to trust each other completely. In the center of the group, cradling a young gorilla against her chest, was a female that Harold recognized immediately. The same silver-touched fur, the same powerful build, the same careful way of moving that spoke of intelligence and experience. It was her, the mother from the road encounter, now returned to the routine patterns of gorilla family life. And the infant she carried, now obviously healthy and alert, bore the unmistakable signs of the rescued child. A small scar on its forehead where the anaconda's coils had pressed too tightly. A slightly cautious way of moving that suggested remembered trauma, but not lasting damage. The little gorilla was alive, thriving, integrated back into the complex social structure of its extended family. The entire troop moved with casual alertness through the clearing, each individual aware of the human observers on the ridge, but showing no signs of alarm. This was the behavior of animals that had learned to distinguish between different types of human encounter, the dangerous and the benign, the threatening and the protective. As the female passed directly below their vantage point, she paused and looked up. Her dark eyes found Harold's across the distance, and for a moment that stretched beyond normal time. The two beings regarded each other with perfect understanding. No fear. No aggression. No need for dominance displays or submission signals. Simply recognition between two individuals who had shared a moment of profound cooperation. The look lasted perhaps 3 seconds in real time, but it contained volumes of communication, acknowledgement of their shared experience, confirmation that the rescue had been successful and meaningful, a sense of closure that transcended language or species barriers. Then she continued her journey, rejoining the flow of her family group as they disappeared into the green canopy. Harold lowered his binoculars slowly, aware that he had just witnessed the conclusion of a story that began months earlier on a dusty road. The infant gorilla had not merely survived, it had thrived, grown, and found its place in the larger community that would shape its entire life. The mother had successfully navigated the complex challenge of raising a child in an environment where danger could appear without warning from multiple directions. Jesse stood beside him, his own binoculars focused on the spot where the troop had vanished. The younger ranger understood that he had been privileged to witness something rare and precious, not just the recovery of an individual animal, but the restoration of a family bond that might have been severed by a moment of predatory violence. The weight of Harold's old ranger hat settling on Jesse's head came as a complete surprise. The hat was weathered leather and canvas, shaped by decades of sun, rain, and constant wear. It carried the accumulated scent of campfire smoke, insect repellent, and the indefinable musk of the deep forest. Most importantly, it carried the symbolic weight of knowledge passed from one generation of protectors to the next. Harold's words carried the finality of a torch being passed, a responsibility transferred from hands growing too old to bear it alone to younger hands ready to accept the burden and the privilege. Jesse felt the hat's familiar weight. He had watched Harold wear it for 6 months now, but experienced it differently as its new owner. The old ranger's promise to become the storyteller, while Jesse took on the active role of protection, carried deeper meaning than a simple changing of professional duties. Stories were important in conservation work. They carried the emotional weight that transformed abstract concepts like biodiversity and habitat protection into visceral understanding of why the work mattered. Harold's stories would inspire new rangers, secure funding from administrators, and keep alive the memory of why certain battles were worth fighting. But the active work of protection, the daily patrols, the equipment maintenance, the dangerous interventions when human and animal interests collided, that work belonged to younger bodies and quicker reflexes. Jesse understood that he was being entrusted with more than a career path. He was being asked to become a guardian of something precious and increasingly rare in a world where wild spaces shrank daily. The drive back to headquarters was quiet, but it was the comfortable silence of shared understanding rather than the awkward quiet of strangers. Both men had been changed by their experiences, but in complementary rather than identical ways. Harold had found peace in the knowledge that his decades of work would continue through others who understood its true importance. Jesse had discovered that his chosen profession was less about enforcing regulations and more about serving as a bridge between human civilization and the wild communities that shared the same planet. As they reached the main ranger station, Harold made one final observation that would stay with Jesse for the rest of his career. The relationship between humans and wildlife was not a zero-sum game where one species' success required another's failure. Instead, it was a complex dance of mutual dependence, where success for one partner ultimately benefited all. The gorilla mother's acceptance of human help during her moment of greatest need had not diminished her wildness or independence. If anything, it had demonstrated the sophisticated intelligence that allowed her species to navigate an increasingly complex world where survival sometimes required accepting assistance from unexpected sources. Her brief acknowledgement of the rangers on the ridge showed that she had incorporated their intervention into her understanding of the world without losing the essential gorilla-ness that defined her existence. Jesse would carry this lesson forward as he developed his own approach to conservation work. Protection was not about imposing human will upon natural systems, but about understanding those systems well enough to know when intervention helped and when it harmed. It required the humility to recognize that humans were not separate from nature, but part of it, with responsibilities that came from their unique capabilities rather than any inherent superiority. Years later, when Jesse had become the senior ranger training newcomers of his own, he would tell the story of the gorilla rescue with the same mixture of factual precision and emotional resonance that Harold had brought to his own teaching. The details might shift slightly, with each telling the size of the anaconda, the exact duration of the rescue, the specific words exchanged between the rangers, but the core truth would remain unchanged. Sometimes, when human courage, combined with respect for the intelligence and dignity of other species, miracles became possible. Not the supernatural miracles of religious tradition, but the entirely natural miracles that occurred when different forms of consciousness recognized their fundamental kinship and chose cooperation over conflict. The baby gorilla that had lain lifeless on cracked asphalt would grow to adulthood, eventually becoming a mother herself. Her children would carry no memory of the anaconda encounter, but they would benefit from the survival skills and protective instincts that their mother had honed through her experience of nearly losing everything that mattered to her. And somewhere in the Congo Basin, an anaconda continued its ancient role as apex predator. Its failure to secure one particular meal, forgotten in the endless cycle of hunt and survival that had shaped its species for millions of years. The snake had not been defeated or driven away permanently. It had simply encountered a situation where its perfectly adapted hunting strategy met variables that exceeded its ability to process and respond. The forest contained room for all of them: gorillas, snakes, humans, and the countless other species that wove together the complex tapestry of life in one of Earth's last great wildernesses. The challenge for each species was learning to navigate the relationships that determine survival, reproduction, and the continuation of genetic heritage into an uncertain future. Jesse adjusted Harold's hat, now his own, and looked out over the forest canopy that stretched to the horizon in every direction. Somewhere out there, a gorilla mother was teaching her child the skills needed to survive in a world full of both dangers and wonders. Somewhere else, rangers like himself were conducting patrols, checking equipment, and preparing for the next emergency that would test their courage and judgment. The work continued, as it always had and always would, carried forward by individuals who understood that protecting wild places and wild creatures was ultimately about protecting the conditions that allowed life in all its forms to flourish. It was work that demanded everything from those who chose it: physical courage, emotional resilience, intellectual curiosity, and the wisdom to know when to act and when to step back. But it was also work that offered rewards impossible to measure in conventional terms. The knowledge that a family had been kept intact, the satisfaction of seeing damaged ecosystems begin to recover, the privilege of witnessing moments of pure wildness that reminded observers why such places needed to exist independent of human purpose or understanding. As the sun set over the endless green canopy, Jesse felt the weight of responsibility settle around him. Like a familiar coat, tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions, new opportunities to either help or harm the intricate web of relationships that kept the forest alive and thriving. He was ready.